Hello, and welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. We are delighted to be here today with the Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace. She is Associate Dean at Lancaster Theological Seminary and Moravian Theological Seminary, as well as Associate Pastor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. So we are thrilled to have, and host of Womanist Bible Talk, a podcast that we'll end up talking about later. So Dr. Lovelace, we are delighted that you are with us today to talk about the book of Job, which is, I now maybe I should change my tone away from delight in order to talk about the book of Job. This is a difficult book that contains an account of profound suffering and some really big theological questions for us to wrestle with. I'd love it if you could start us off by telling us what we'll encounter in the book of Job, in terms of its format and structure and themes. What kind of book is this, and what will we find in it?
Just one clarification. I hope someday perhaps to return to congregational ministry and become an associate pastor, but it's associate professor.
Oh, did I call you associate pastor? I'm sorry. Associate professor of Hebrew Bible.
You were projecting.
I am projecting. That's right.
So I think Job is certainly one of those books that is surprising, I think, for many Christians in the Old Testament. As you had mentioned, certainly the Older Testament, but again, within our Christian teaching of the Bible, we're not accustomed to Hebrew Bible or Tanakh or some of the other terms that Jewish readers, for one, would be more accustomed to, or academic scholars. And so we still pretty much do understand it as the Old Testament. And we are surprised to find it there because this is a person, it's the main character is a non-Israelite. He's not Hebrew. We find some characters, we find realms between the heavenly realm interacting with the human realm, the earthly realm, and the differences in our understanding of who those characters are. We have perhaps a turning of our theology and our beliefs around the idea that good things happen to bad people, certainly that things tend to be causal. If you do this, then this is what you reap the benefits or the consequences of your behavior. And then we also have so we have Job, this wonderful person who's described as righteous, upright, as a good man. He's a blessed man, and God sees him as all of these things, and he's that thought or that image of him is challenged by one of the characters, and then he suffers all of these calamities, and his friends, first his wife and then his friends, sit with him and try and convince him that he just needs to repent, turn from his wicked ways, perhaps, and then all would be made right. But it's certainly something that he must have done to have caused this, and he insists that this is not the case. And then later on, we get him actually not only questioning God and challenging God, but in some of the legalese that really comes out in the book, that he challenges and wants to be heard, wants his day in court,
Yeah.
and wants to be judged by God, who he sees as the righteous judge. And then God goes around with him in kind of like, it is my prerogative. I'm God and I can do as I please, and never really answers his question why he has been made to suffer. And then in the end, he is, we would say that all of the things he lost is restored, but of course you can never replace all of the things that he lost in terms of his children. And so I think that in essence is the story of Job.
Yeah.
So what are we to make of this answer that he gets, or this non-answer that Job gets from God out of the whirlwind? What is that meant to be satisfying, unsatisfying? And then followed by the final restoration. It's like God doesn't really give Job an answer, but then at the end, the righteous man is rewarded. Um, how do we hold these things in tension in this book, or what does it do theologically to have these different narrative and poetic elements together in this way?
I like how one scholar put it, and I think I will say that one of the reasons I chose to become a Hebrew Bible scholar of all of the other disciplines was because I really appreciated how complicated life is complicated. And the stories of the people in the Old Testament are complicated. If you want the most dysfunctional families in the world, they're in the Bible. If you want backstabbing, treachery, uh, just all the things that you imagine that humans go through, they're in the story. My son loved, what is it? The Throne of, what is the series?
Oh, Game of
Game of
Thrones.
Thrones. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
And I said to him once, everything, if you want to really read about the Game of Thrones, just turn to First and Second Kings. Everything that's going on in Game of Thrones happened in First and Second Kings. And so I think to answer your question, because life is complicated and God is saying that as well as yes, I created, so we actually get another creation story outside of the stories in Genesis, where God says, I created the heavens, I created the earth, I created the creatures in the sea, I created all the beauty in the world. All of that is mine, but I also created the monsters in the sea, and some of the less pleasant things are also part of creation, a part of being human and living in this creation. And so you have to take the good with the bad. And that's kind of what the answer that God gives Job.
Yeah, that theology at the end in the whirlwind is a little terrifying because it's kind of like, who promised you that the world was a safe place?
Yes.
And a lot of us modern people especially don't like to think that way. Right. Or we find beauty in nature, we find God in nature, but there's also this savagery or risk, maybe danger in nature too, that seems to be part of that. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's really part of that message. And when you couple that with what we call in academia the Deuteronomistic history, of the history of Israel from the book of Joshua to the book of Second Kings, there's this theology in there that God has covenanted with these people, has agreed to take on the people of Israel as God's people, and God will be their God, and God will be this beneficent God or benevolent God who, as long as they keep the covenant, that they will be rewarded, they will have land, they will have fecundity, the fertility, their animals will be fertile, the people will be fertile, and they will be cared for. But if they don't, then they will lose the land and they will lose that their animals will be uh, infertile, or people I just barren. And so it's kind of like this image of a barren land and the barren animals and the barren people, the women, and eventually being removed from the land and all the other uh, punishment. There's a list of things that God says will befall them if they do not keep the covenantal the terms of the agreement. It's in one sense, it's an instruction book in how to live as the people of God, but it also comes with some obligations and responsibilities. And God says, or at least the theology is that if you don't keep the covenant and the terms of the agreement, then you will have to suffer the consequences. And so this book is put in alongside of that theology where Job is in this situation where it is not anything that he has done. He is righteous. He is blameless, as he's described in the beginning of the book. And we have this scene, this throne room scene in heaven where God is meeting with these, we'll say, angelic, not angelic beings, but these what's the term I'm looking for? Certainly non-human.
Yeah.
But you have this one who are just going back and forth between heaven and earth, and they're reporting back to God on how things are going on earth. How are things going with the humans? And so in this one instance, this what we call the Satan, and most people think it's a personal name, Satan, but it's actually a title, which means accuser. God asks, what do you think of my servant Job? And it's like, well, he's happy and things are well and he blesses you, but I'm pretty sure it's only because you have blessed him and it's because of all the things that you have given him. But if you took those things away, he would curse you. And so God agrees to allow him to destroy all of his possessions. And Job does not curse God. So the Satan goes back to God and God says, well, what do you think now? And he says, well, that's because those were possessions. But if you took away his children or those he loves, then he would curse you. And so God allows this. And sure enough, again, Job does not curse God. And so the Satan goes back to God once more and says, well, okay, still is not personal enough. If you touched his body,
Yeah.
And allows and God permits him to allow all these boils and sores to appear on his body. And again, he doesn't curse God. But then when he sits with his friends who are trying to console him and with his wife, his wife is, depending on how one, because in Hebrew, the word bless can be curse or bless. Does she tell him, just curse God and die? Or did she say, well, why don't you just bless God so that God will be benevolent towards you and kill you and put you out of your misery? But in any case, and he tells his wife, oh, that's nonsense you're speaking. But even with his friends, there is this understanding that it's something that he did. It's got to be that, and so we don't get into specifically covenantal language and expectation because, again, Job is not Israelite, but they're, again, put alongside, there is this, for the readers, they're reading it through the lens of, clearly this is about that he must have done something and therefore he is getting his the just rewards, or at least the right punishment. Because as we get to the end of that Deuteronomistic history and the people of Israel have continued to fail to live into those obligations, and the kings, the monarchs lead them, and sometimes prophets lead them into not keep the prophet. Well, sometimes yes, we do have good and bad prophets, but there is just this. We get to the end of Kings, and God has had enough, and finally allows them to suffer the consequences of not having kept the covenant by allowing them to be taken captive into Babylon. And so if you're reading it through that lens as an audience, you're still thinking that, of course, yes, this is what we know this from our own experience, that when we didn't do as God had commanded, that we had to pay the price for that. That God is what we call retributive justice. God was just in punishing us when God said that this is what would happen. This would be our um, consequences for our deeds. And so then how do you reconcile that with, indeed, this man is blameless and upright? And coming out on the end of that to say, here's another perspective on God. Here's another way of living as the people of God that doesn't blame us for our suffering, but to acknowledge, as Matt was saying, that, that the world is good, but it also has evil.
Yeah.
Well, you brought up the word justice. I bet we have some questions about that. Go ahead, Margaret.
Yeah. So, I mean, I love where you've taken us with the complexity of the theology in Job. And on the one hand, I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that the book overall does not privilege the perspective of Job's friends, right? Who seem to be insisting that there must be an explanation of Job's suffering according to some pretty simplistic principles of retributive justice. And one of the things that I have found personally very comforting about the book of Job is that it doesn't pretend that the universe operates in an explainable way in which bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. I mean, we live in a world where our sort of lived experiences of a suffering that is not fairly distributed in many cases. And so there's some resonance in there. But I also really struggle with the vision of God that the book of Job does hold up, in which God has this conversation with Hasatan at the beginning and allows bad things to happen to a righteous person. I don't like that view of things either. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of expand on this view of God. You've got your podcast, Womanist Bible Talk. I listened to your interview before this conversation with Dr. Marlene Underwood about the book of Job, talking about a God in Job who seems almost abusive as a character. And I'm wondering if you can sort of pull out that theme for us, or kind of share with us that dynamic as you understand it in the book of Job.
Yes, and so Marlene is, on the one hand, she is building on another womanist scholar, Renita Weems' book, Battered Love, who talks about this relationship between God and Israel as one of the, God has been is understood in binary ways that are not equal or unequal. And so you have parent-child, you have master-slave, you have suzerain vassal, and you have husband-wife. And so as much as we hope that our marriages are equal in how we see each other with our spouses, that in the ancient world, a husband was over his wife, and the wife was in a subordinate position to the husband. And so one of the ways that the prophets have talked about the relationship between Israel and God and that breaking of that covenant is as a God as the husband and Israel as the wife, and an unfaithful wife who has gone astray. And therefore, the husband is right in punishing the wife for having both sullied his reputation because men can have, in the ancient world, can have relationships with other women unless it's another man's wife. But you certainly, women didn't have that same privilege. And so husbands certainly, not only would you bring shame to your husband by having this relationship that we would then had been made public, which would bring the shame to the husband. And so that in order to redeem himself, the husband has to punish the wife. And so we kind of see this. And so taking that metaphor, and then Marlene goes the next step with her understanding of the stages of abuse or cycles of abuse in intimate partnership relationships, that she kind of saw this cycle in the book of Job with the God as an abuser, as abusive, in going through these stages of not only allowing the Satan to cause all of this distress and all of this abuse, really, of Job, but then the consoling Job in the end, and making everything. I can certainly give you gifts or other ways of making up to make things right, and then the cycle begins again. And so, being for her as someone seeing this kind of abuse, she saw that in the way this story falls and into place and how it comes together. And so that certainly is one thing. I think also, while we want to, and while I want people who are certainly practicing their faith to have not a simplistic understanding of God, but I also can understand why someone might say, well, then what's the point if we can't trust that God is just and God is fair, because we say that, and does allow just bad things to happen to good people on a whim.
How would you, I love all of that in the way that, right, that the book doesn't give us a view of God that is somehow, well, if you only understood what life is like for God, you wouldn't complain. I mean, I don't think that the book takes us there. And if it does, we should push back against that in a variety of ways because of what happens to Job. And this is in some ways Job's point, right? We never get Job's final rebuttal at the end or something like that.
Right.
But what does this mean for you as you think about the book of Job, like in a pastoral setting? I know people who talk about the book of Job as the place they go when they're dealing with grief.
Mm.
Is it a good place to go when you're grieving? I guess is my question. I mean, is it? It has that
I think
reputation, right? If this is where you
it,
go when life doesn't make sense, but then you read it and you think, well, life still doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
yeah, no, and that was where, so, trying to find that balance is not easy when, um, oh, I wish I could remember. It was something else that Marlene said that it's the other point. I don't know if Megan, that you recall that um, it's not about what happens when bad things happen to good people. Was something else that she said, which I think would be helpful as to where I'm trying to go. But and again, she was saying to complicate our image of Job, and that we shouldn't just lean on, how would I put it? That yes, it's not just that if you do all the right things, it's not like the prosperity theology that if you pay enough to the pastor, or to give all your savings to God, or that you can't buy happiness, you can't buy your favor with God, and so you don't certainly want to, or you want to dispel any of those notions that we can do anything to curry favor or to buy favor with God, and we don't want the sense that that things that we do cause it's not our sins that caused the floods in Katrina, or the tsunamis in other parts of the world. And so again, it's the blaming the victim that I think she's really trying to get at, that that we tend to do, because if we can blame the victim, then we can take comfort that if I do all the right things, that just won't happen to me.
Right.
And I think that's what happens with some sometimes people will judge a rape victim to say, well, it must have been where you were or what you were wearing, because if I can assure myself that if I wear the right clothing and I'm in the right places and I'm with the right people, then that won't happen to me.
Yeah.
And so I think we want to help people to understand that this is not that we are trying to get away from blaming Job, and saying that somehow it's what you did that caused this.
Yeah.
And that sometimes in the natural world, children die and people take ill and bad things happen. And God is also there, and God is also present, and God is also looking out for you and listening. That we can go to God. The fact that Job felt that he could personally take on God and not be struck dead. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes that people feel that or are taught, well, you can't question God.
Right.
And that's is what the Bible says. This is it, and you can't ask any questions. And so we've really had a lot of people when they come to seminary are surprised that it's a space where they can raise those questions, and we encourage questions.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it is okay to question God. This is just what Job does, to say, I think I didn't do anything. I've done everything that you've asked me to do. I've gone and made my sacrifices or sent up my offerings. I've done all the things that a good worshiper or observant person should do. And I've even made offerings on behalf of my children, just
Yeah.
in case they did something. And he takes it straight to God.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one lesson is, if you want to scream at God, if you want to take it straight to God, you can do so, and you are not going to be struck dead.
Yeah. No, I do
Uh,
think that's a really valuable lesson of Job. I mean, we just finished a 5-week unit on the Psalms, including some of those lament psalms where individuals are saying hard things to God. In Job, it's just chapters and chapters of it, just this emphasis again and again. And I do think Job is helpful as a sort of corrective impulse to some of our worst pastoral care tendencies of explaining away people's suffering. Job's pretty clear in the example of the friends that that's not an okay thing to do when you're the one caring for somebody undergoing something. Yeah, I think that's
yes. And
interesting.
again, and not to blame the victim.
Yeah, not to blame the victim. Yep, absolutely. I think we've got time for one more question. Matt, do you have one ready at hand?
Unless you do.
No, please go for it.
Oh, um, I guess my question is, um, how does, in your perspective, like, what does it mean that a book like this is part of the canon? I mean, we talked a bit about some of the ways of trying to integrate this with the bigger Deuteromistic story, or ways that it doesn't integrate, but you've got this book that really stands by itself. Like, there's nothing else quite like it in the entire Christian Bible, for example. What is it? Does that mean anything in particular to you? Like, what's the value added of that, I guess, or something like that?
I think
Maybe a more personal question.
especially, well, okay, that's a different way of answering it. I'll answer as I was about to, and maybe I'll get to the personal. That because it's part of what we call the writings, again, when we look at the Hebrew or the Jewish way of looking at what we call the Old Testament, we tend to see it in 4 parts, but they see it in 3 parts. And so you have your first part, the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. Then you have your middle part, which are the prophets. And that's what we consider the former or the major and minor prophets, as well as the books of Judges, Samuel, Kings. But then you get into, and they kind of take shape chronologically. And so then you get to the writings. And that's the part that's got what we call the wisdom literature. You've got your Song of Songs and Job and Psalms and Ecclesiastes. You have these books that I think reflect as both the Assyrian destruction and invasion of Israel in the north in 722 BCE, and then you get you're moving towards and during some of these writings, the Babylonian invasion and conquest in the 6th century, 5th century, that you start to get the Israelites, they're more engaged with the Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, the other cultures. And I think they really start to more engage in storytelling and styles of writings that reflect living in that context.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one part of it. But I also think that as they've tried to still wrestle with those disastrous events in their lives and their relationship with God, that they've had to renegotiate how they moved from a Deuteronomistic of the covenant, the punishment and the rewards and punishment model of doing right, to a needing to have some other ways to understand God and God acting in exile, for one, returning to now Yehu, Judah, for another. Then we need to have some other ways of talking about God and understanding God that are more nuanced and are not as simplistic, and give us other options for living.
Yeah. It's a great reminder that theology is always changing.
Yes.
But not just based on life happens, but also in our encounters with other people and the stories they tell.
Yes.
That if we expect to find a flat, one-dimensional theology in Scripture, we're going to be delightfully disappointed, I would hope.
Absolutely.
That's a good way to put it. Well, thank you, Matt, for that wrap up. And Dr. Lovelace, we are so grateful for your time with us, your sharing of your wisdom and your expertise with us. The podcast is Womanist Bible Talk. I would heartily recommend it as a way to encounter womanist scholarship on many of the same topics and books that we have been encountering. So thank you for your time. We really appreciate you.
And thank you for this invitation. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thanks for being with us.